Ahora voy a conmutar nuevamente a inglés. In order to continue, we are going to follow with the next presentation. Unfortunately, Professor Michael Pollitt, our next presenter, will not be live presenting because he's in another seminar at the same time. Fortunately, he provided his presentation in advance, so I am going to present both the video and the slides. Professor Michael Pollitt is well known in the energy sector and the economics. He's Assistant Director of the Energy Policy Research Group and Professor of Business Economics at the Judge Business School of the University of Cambridge, UK. He is a professor of business economics, a fellow of and director of studies in economics and management at Sydney Sussex College. He is also a research associate of the Centre for Business Research and a member of the Faculty of Economics. Now I am going to present, to start the presentation. Me cuenta.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today.
Perfecto.
So I'm Michael Pollitt, and I'm a professor of business economics at the Judge Business School and an assistant director of the Energy Policy Research Group at the University of Cambridge. Today I'm going to talk to you about the future of regulation, and specifically I'm going to talk about regulation for electricity distribution system operators, so electricity distribution companies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some work that I was involved with recently, looking at the future of the regulation of the electricity distribution system operator in Europe. So I'm going to talk about a study that looks at this that I did for the Centre on Regulation in Europe, and hopefully there'll be some interesting observations that might carry over into the situation in Chile. So I should begin by thanking my co-authors on this report, Karim Anaya and Monica Giulietti, and the various sponsoring organisations that that supported the research. The full report is available on the SAR website, and the aim of the report, which is entitled "Optimal Regulation for European DSOs to 2025 and Beyond," was to look at how the regulation of the electricity distribution company could be improved in the light of the energy transition and the increasing addition of renewable electricity to the distribution grid, and the fact that a lot of the new renewables around Europe are being added at distribution level voltages and not at the transmission level, and to look at the regulation, but also to investigate ways in which the current regulatory regime could be improved in ways that would promote social welfare. So optimal in the sense of improvement in the outcomes for society from regulation. So that was what we were looking at. We sought to look at three questions in the report. So how can and should the system operator function of the DSO be defined and regulated? So, you know, if this is the idea that distribution companies would become more active in managing the electricity system at the distribution level, and have a sort of system operation type function in the same way as we observe system operation at the transmission level. What could regulators and European policymakers learn from the regulation of the transmission system operator that might be translated down to the DSO? And then the final question that we sought to investigate was, how could national regulators across Europe and pan-European institutions support the capacity of electricity distribution companies to operate and coordinate the electricity system at lower voltages? So that's what we sought to look at. The way that we approach this in the report is we conducted 2 parallel surveys. We surveyed both national regulatory authorities, NRAs, and the distribution companies themselves, the DSOs. We then looked at a set of case studies where DSOs were involved in promoting the energy transition, and what might be learned from those case studies. And you can see we looked at things like the role of the distribution company in promoting electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and in smart energy system integration at the local or regional level. And then the final approach we took was we developed 5 scenarios where you might think the distribution system operator could play a role in promoting the energy transition, and ask the question if current EU legislation actually actively allowed it to play that role, or was in some sense inhibiting it playing a more optimal role in the energy transition. So we conducted this survey with the help of our friends in the Council of European Energy Regulators and in one of the trade associations for distribution system operators, GEOD, and we got a good number of responses. We had 50 responses in total from 20 countries across Europe, and we also got responses from a good number of NRAs, regulatory authorities, and from distribution system operators. And we cover about 125 million customers served by DSOs and about 225 million customers served by NRAs. So that's a good proportion of the total number of customers across 39 countries that we initially attempted to survey. The DSO respondents come from 17 countries, and we've got a mix of large companies with more than 1 million customers, mid-sized companies with sort of 100,000 to 1 million customers, and smaller companies with less than 100,000 customers. We also have included in the company responses from 2 of the energy network associations in 2 of the European countries that we look at. So what did we find? Well, there's a lot of talk in Europe about this more active role for the distribution company, and regulators across Europe and the European Commission are very keen on promoting a more active electricity distribution company, better managing the constraints that are emerging in the local distribution system. But that progress towards a more active DSO remains pretty slow across Europe, is what our surveys indicate. And if you actually try to measure things like the competitive procurement of congestion management, actually, buying megawatts up or megawatts down within the distribution system in order to manage a constraint, or measure purchases of reactive power, megawatt-hours, in order to manage local voltage constraints. Actually, there's very little competitive purchasing by the distribution company in order to actively manage the system in any European country apart from perhaps in the UK, where there are significant quantities, certainly of megawatts, being purchased at the distribution level in order to manage local constraints within the distribution system. But for most of our survey companies, there's no competitive procurement of congestion management or reactive power. There is a lot of research activity across Europe trying to look at local energy markets, for instance, for congestion and of both megawatts and reactive power, but often these trials are pretty small or at very early stages and haven't actually been completed yet. When you ask the distribution companies, well, what might help promote a more active distribution company, they say that the existing tariff structure around distribution charges and other regulatory barriers are significant for them, whereas the regulators that regulate these distribution companies say that actually what they're worried about is local markets for congestion management sound great, but actually there are problems with the number of bidders that might appear in these markets, and also the lack of information around network condition that currently exists. One of the things that's happened in Europe is that a new pan-European body has been formed, the so-called EU DSO entity, in order to act as a parallel organization to ENTSO-E, which is the transmission level trade association, which is recognized by the EU. And that's with a view to promoting this more active role for the distribution company across Europe. But actually, there are worries expressed in our survey about how representative this organization is going to be, and whether it can really reconcile the disparate interests of distribution companies that range in size from Enedis in France, which might have 30 million customers, down to the very smallest distribution companies in other European countries, which have hundreds of distribution companies like Germany. So while there's a hope that distribution companies can be represented at the European level and that European policy can be joined up in promoting a more active DSO, there is a concern that actually it's going to be difficult to find a single voice for distribution companies and to represent the diversity of their interests, given their very different situations in individual countries and in terms of size. As I mentioned, there's a lot of experimentation going on at the distribution level, and what we did in the surveys was asked what both NRAs and distribution companies knew about experimentation, and we asked them to sort of name projects that they knew about whose results might be worthwhile to learn from. And you might be interested to know that only one national regulator and one of our surveyed distribution companies mentioned any developments outside Europe as being of interest, even though you might think that what's been happening in New York or in Australia might be interesting for European distribution companies, or indeed what might be happening in certain parts of South America. Many distribution companies in America and in Australia, are among the leaders in terms of innovation at the distribution level, but they don't seem to be known about by European participants in our survey. We do compare a number of European countries and show that some are making good progress with a more active distribution company. Countries like the UK do exhibit a lot of innovation at the distribution level and have lessons for the rest of Europe. And the countries that do seem to be doing better in terms of a more active distribution company are the ones where there's a more supportive regulatory environment, where there's funding for distribution innovation and, if you like, a permissive regime at the regulatory level allowing experimentation to take place. So one of the things that has been a big issue in Europe has been the role of regulatory sandboxes, opportunities that the regulator gives for distribution utilities to experiment with different connection arrangements or different charging regimes in order to promote a more active distribution company. So backing off the survey questions around which projects the distribution companies and the regulatory authorities knew about in terms of experimentation, we looked at some of the projects and yeah, they're interesting, but actually many of them are small. So you can see that there's projects looking at sector integration and sector coupling, the coupling of both gas and electricity sectors at the distribution level. But these remain very small projects. I mean, any project which involves a few buildings or a few houses, is a small project in terms of the need to meet net zero at the whole economy level. There are some more substantial projects that our survey participants named, which do appear to be quite interesting. So there's a couple here to do with digital mapping of the electricity system in the UK, which is the ENA Digital Systems Map. That involves all of the GB distribution companies collaborating through their Energy Network Association and the ELAD NL Foundation, which promotes electric vehicle charging in the Netherlands. These sort of pan-country approaches to promoting the role of the distribution company in the energy transition do seem to be more significant than many of the small individual projects run by a single distribution company. So when distribution companies work together across the whole country, that does seem to offer opportunities for real and significant innovation. Okay, so that brings us to the last thing that we looked at in the report, which was asking questions about the future role of the distribution system operator. And what we're doing here is asking the question: does current legislation at the European level support what you might think are significant roles for the DSO in the energy transition? And the aim was to highlight some gaps in the current European legislation, the Clean Energy Package, as it's called, which came out in 2019. So, here we ask, 5 questions which policymakers might ask of electricity distribution companies, and say, well, does the legislation facilitate that? And also maybe what does some of the academic evidence say about it? So imagine a government at the local, regional or national level wants to promote public charging points for electric vehicles. Could it ask its a local electricity distribution company to do this? Now in Europe, the legislation is quite restrictive in terms of whether distribution companies can own and operate electric vehicle charging points, because that's something that we hope might be competitive, and we won't discourage the monopoly distribution company from taking the lead on that. And that's even though some of the academic thinking around this might suggest that there's plenty of circumstances under which you would want the local distribution company to take a lead on this, and there are various things that the local distribution company could be quite good at in terms of promoting electric vehicle charging. So here's a second potential electricity transition scenario which the DSO might be involved with. So the local government or any level of government in the country comes along to distribution companies or a particular distribution company and says, want you to coordinate electricity and gas system decarbonisation within a particular area. So what role can the electricity DSO play in this? And actually, although there is an obligation on electricity and gas transmission companies to coordinate in the energy transition, there isn't an obligation on local distribution companies to coordinate. And there might be plenty of scope for joint optimization of electricity and gas assets at the local level, but actually the current EU legislation doesn't actively promote that. And here's another one. All this effort to promote competition in the provision of constraint management services and in the matching of supply and demand within the distribution system, is that consistent with situations where when you do the optimization calculation, it's obvious that a single battery connected deep within the distribution system would solve all of the local grid management problems at least cost without the need for an expensive upgrade? What should the role of the incumbent DSO be in the provision of that single asset which would solve all local constraint problems? Now, the European legislation leaves room for interpretation, but in general, national interpretations of the European law towards this don't favour the local monopoly solving these local constraints by procuring its own battery. In a lot of European jurisdictions, it wouldn't be allowed for the local distribution company just to acquire its own battery and trade electricity in order to meet a local constraint. Even though when you look at many of the pilot projects which are looking at local constraint management, they do often involve a battery with some interest from the local electricity distribution company. So there would seem to be issues around if it's optimal for a monopoly solution to local constraints, there's often restrictions on that solution being implemented. Okay, here's a fourth regulatory case study. So local electricity stakeholders often ask for guidance on the likely development of the electricity system in their locality over the period of any potential investment in, say, providing megawatt flexibility or megavar flexibility within the distribution system. So, okay, I'm willing to provide a competitive service as a local battery in order to meet local distribution constraints, but you're going to have to tell me what the likely evolution of the network is, so I can work out what the potential demand is and what the potential price might be that you're going to pay me within the local constraint market. That does suggest the importance of 10-year development planning, which is something that is being moved towards it across Europe at the distribution level. But you do need really quite sophisticated planning and information provision in order to give useful information to potential investors in flexibility service provision at the distribution level. I mean, my experience of working on these projects is, it's very difficult to calculate what the likely future constraint management demand is going to be, let alone calculate what the likely future constraint management price might be that the distribution company would pay a third party. And that's going to require much more sophisticated planning tools than we currently see at the distribution level. And then finally, the last regulatory case study that we consider is the national regulatory authority and or its national and local governments want the distribution companies to be more innovative and proactive in the energy transition, but what exactly should be the role of the DSO in promoting bottom-up innovation? So interestingly, European legislation within the clean energy package has a lot of talk about being innovative, but interestingly, it's very silent on mechanisms for actually promoting innovation. So if you consider what's been successful in the UK in making UK DSOs world leaders in DSO innovation, it has been the provision of generous customer finance research and development budgets and the provision of a sort of permissive regulatory regime and regulatory sandboxing, which has allowed experimentation to take place. So having the right institutional environment to promote innovation is what causes innovative services, innovative pricing, and innovative companies. And actually, the European legislation doesn't give any guidance on mechanisms for promoting innovation. Some national regulators across Europe are clearly better than others at promoting innovation, and the distribution companies that we surveyed express support for more innovation promoting mechanisms like those that are seen in the UK. Okay, so what about some high-level observations on on optimal regulation for DSOs and how you can promote a more active role for electricity distribution companies in the energy transition? Well, the observations that we would make from Europe is European legislation is already out of date. So the fourth energy package, which was largely implemented in 2019, actually predates net zero. Now we've got other European legislation coming along, but given the sort of time lag that there is in formulating legislation and getting it implemented, which I know you know all about in Chile, there is this need to constantly be checking your legislation as to whether it really is appropriate for the degree of ambition that you have for your energy transition. And in spite of lots of talk about the desirability of more active DSOs, when you measure actual progress, it's been very slow. There has been a lot of experimentation, but very little organized learning. And, and a major necessity is for pan-European organizations such as the EU DSO entity to actually promote the spreading of useful information and experiences, and for national regulatory authorities to ask tougher questions about whether this particular experiment which is going on actually is worth funding, given that actually it's probably replicating an experiment that we already know the answer to from somewhere else. The responses that we had from the regulators and from the distribution companies to our surveys suggest that actually they're not fully aligned in what they think the best way forward is. There's more work to do in regulators explaining to DSOs what they want, and also in DSOs convincing regulators that there need to be some changes to the regulatory regime to promote a more active DSO. In Europe, we're very concerned about this concept of sector coupling, joint decarbonisation of electricity and natural gas sectors. And as I pointed out in the case studies, actually that isn't currently reflected on the requirements on electricity DSOs to cooperate with gas DSOs, or gas DSOs to cooperate with electricity DSOs. There's still a lack of clarity on the role of the distribution company in the procurement of local storage assets or in the promotion of EV charging points, even though you would think that if you want a rapid energy transition, it might often be the case that the local distribution company should take a key role in leading the installation of both EV charging points and storage to relieve local congestion problems. My final point would be that although that there's a lot of talk about the desirability of a more active electricity distribution system operator to promote the energy transition, actually there's precious little evidence that actually that is a good way to promote the energy transition. So, at the European level, national regulators and the European Commission are very keen on the active DSO. They want to see more innovation at the electricity distribution level, but actually the evidence that local congestion markets actually are cost effective, that's all pretty limited. And there clearly needs to be more attention to whether this regulatory push and push on research and development expenditure in order to research into local energy markets and a more active DSO, actually whether any of that is worth it and which aspects of it are worth it, because a lot of it is not proven at the moment. Okay, well, look, thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about some of the regulatory developments and shortcomings in Europe, and I do wish you all the best for the rest of your conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Pollitt for his thorough presentation.